Across the centuries, the only punishment feared more than death was banishment, the wrenching of a body from its home, the enforced severing of memory from place. Today, we call the punishment cruel and unusual, yet the idea of being cast out still haunts our collective moral imagination. But what of those figures who walk towards that distance willingly? What of exile, not as an expulsion, but as a posture of seeing the world? Exile is usually imagined as physical displacement, but for James Baldwin and Palestinian-American scholar Edward Said, exile is far more intricate. It is a discipline of estrangement, a vantage point from which the world sharpens into stunning clarity. Estrangement hurts, but it also illuminates. It is a wound that teaches. Legal theorists define banishment as denationalization, the total removal of a person from the body politic, the exclusion by a state from all its territory. Banishment leaves no agency, no return, no residue of belonging. Exile is different, however. Exile is characterized by territorial absence, public pressure, and an orientation of return. The exile carries a memory of home, however fractured it may be, and with it a strange kind of power. Exiles have historically been revolutionaries, dissidents, and social innovators, figures who see their society scaffolding more clearly because they stand just outside of it. Exile wounds the heart, but it sharpens the eye. Edward Said describes exile as the unhealable rift between a human being and a native place, a sorrow that literature and history romanticize, but never manage to resolve. Yet even within this grief, Said insists that there is a gift to be had, the ability to perceive history as constructed rather than fated. To see things not as inevitable, he writes, but as the result of human choices. Exile reveals that nothing is natural, permanent, or ordained. Exile is clarity at a price. Where Said theorizes exile, Baldwin lives it. For James Baldwin, exile was no metaphor, it was the texture of Black American life. In Switzerland, he is the village's first Black visitor, greeted with the astonishment reserved for the purely unimaginable. He contrasts this with America, where Black presence is centuries old, and thus white innocence is a myth that cannot be withstood for. The Swiss villagers cry out of surprise towards him. Americans cry out of history. As Baldwin writes, the abyss is experience, the American experience. In Europe and America alike, Baldwin carries a double estrangement, outside of white cultural inheritance and outside the Africa of his ancestors. This double absence heightens his sight, though. He says, "These are not my creations. I might search in them in vain forever for any reflection of myself." To be in exile, Baldwin suggests, is to see what others cannot. It is to notice the absences, the missing faces in the monuments, the silent histories beneath the stones. And it is to decide whether to use that estrangement that Baldwin makes imperative. If Baldwin's essays show exile as an ethical vision, his novel Giovanni's Room shows what happens when ethical exile is rejected. David, the novel's protagonist, is an American in Paris, geographically displaced yet desperate to avoid existential embarrassment and displacement. He flees the estrangement that might allow himself to see himself more clearly. Of his supposed willpower, he confesses, people who believe they are the masters of their destiny can only continue to believe this by becoming specialists in self-deception. David's entire life is perpetual motion without meaning. It is a choreography of avoidance. He exiles himself not to gain clarity, but to escape from it. Giovanni sees this clearly. He says, "You have never really been here. You looked at me with such eyes, as though you did not see me." Giovanni's room, the main setting of the story, is cluttered, intimate, and unguarded, and it becomes a metaphor for ethical exile, a place where one might face oneself honestly and genuinely. But David flees from the room, and in doing so, flees from himself once more. His betrayals of Giovanni, of his fiancée Hella, and ultimately of himself, are failures of vision, He narrates his life with the clarity of hindsight and retrospect, but without the courage to have ever acted differently or ever act differently. He is exiled in the worst way possible, not because he chooses his estrangement, but because he refused to inhabit it. Where Baldwin stands in exile and sees, David runs from it and becomes blind. Said offers the theory, exile as the intellectual's vantage point, the margin from which society becomes legible. Baldwin offers the moral urgency, exile as a condition lived in the body, shaped by race, sexuality, fear, and the American myth. They converge on the same insight. Clarity arises not from belonging, but from distance. They diverge in texture. Said's exile is cultural and intellectual. Baldwin's is visceral, historical, and racial in nature. But together they show that exile is not misfortune. It is discipline. To be in exile is to be taught how to see. Where Baldwin and Said reveal, each in their own ways, is this. Exile is a wound, yes, but it is a wound that illuminates. To inhabit exile, whether by circumstance or by courage, is to acquire a stance from which the world comes into view without its usual excuses. To refuse exile is to remain trapped within the matrix, trapped within the illusion, and the narcotic security of belonging. Exile is not about being cast out. It is about seeing from the margins of society. It is about understanding that history is made, not given, and it is about learning to tell the truth, including to oneself most of all. Baldwin and Said remind us that moral clarity rarely comes from home and security. Instead, it comes from the periphery, where the familiar loosens and vision begins.